that, except that Eastern Poland, yeah, right, borders, the way in which these borders were tended to be defined in the post-World War I period was by ethnicity. And that's not as helpful as it might be in Eastern Europe, because there were very few areas which were exclusively occupied by one linguistic group or one ethnicity over another. But when Poland was Poland after 1921, after 1919, was an explicitly imperialist country. They had the design of taking a huge amount, the Polish ruling class, of taking over a huge amount of land, mainly from the newly formed Soviet Russia. And they did manage to seize territories which are now in Belarus and in Ukraine, which were mainly inhabited by Belarusians and Ukrainians, and they just seized them. They had never been. They had been part of Poland up to 1774, and the explicit goal of the Polish upper ruling class, and after the formation of the Polish state after World War I, was to recreate the Polish-Lithuanian state as it was at the end of the 18th century, when it was at its biggest extent. So it was an explicitly imperialist state. And they were extremely racist against not just Jews, because these areas were also highly populated by Jews, but especially in the towns, but explicitly very racist against Ukrainians and Belarusians, and suppressing their languages, their schools, their churches, and so forth and so on. So Eastern Poland was really these territories which had been taken from Soviet Russia as a result of the Russo-Polish War of 1919 to 1921 in the Treaty of Riga, which was signed in 1921. And the Poland sent settlers, they called them settlers, mainly demobilized military people, as well as, of course, the political infrastructure, governmental infrastructure, to colonize these areas. They called it Polonization. So this was an explicitly imperialist strategy. Nevertheless, the Soviets were forced to take these lands back by the Germans. At the beginning, after September the 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the strategy, or at least the Soviets believed, the rest of the world believed it too, that the Polish government would be the Polish forces would be rapidly defeated, the Polish government would retreat to the east. Under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which Gary spoke about, there was a secret clause that divided up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. And Eastern Poland, these areas that had been taken from Soviet Russia in 1921, were designated as being in the Soviet sphere of influence. That didn't mean they were annexed. That means they were in the sphere of influence. What that meant was that when Germany smashed the Polish army, as everybody except apparently the Polish ruling class thought was going to happen, and it did happen, the Polish government would retreat to the east, because of course there was no place else for them to go, really. And once they got into this area of Eastern Poland, which had formerly been part of Soviet Russia, but was now part of Poland, the Germans would not be able to follow, because this was now, according to this treaty, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Non-Aggression Treaty, this was part of the Soviet sphere of influence. So the Polish government would be able to set itself up, would be able to stay there, and the German army would not be able to attack them there, or at least would have to pull back, okay, in order to fulfill the obligations of this treaty. And then what would happen is, presumably Western Poland would now be taken over by the Nazis, by Germany, by Hitler. Eastern Poland would still be Poland. It would be a much shrunken part of Poland. It would be a part of Poland that had a pretty strong communist movement, underground communist movement. It would be under strong Soviet influence. But the Germans wouldn't be able to conquer it. So now the Soviet Union would be able to have a buffer state on its border, all right, keeping it away from Germany, right? Germany would be on the west, and then there'd be the shrunken Polish state, and then there would be the Soviet Union. And this state, this buffer state, while highly anti-communist, would also now be anti-German, okay, because they had been smashed by the German army. And that would be a situation which would be sort of more or less desirable, about the best that the Soviets could achieve. Okay, you got the picture? So that's what the sphere of influence agreement in the Non-Aggression Pact made possible. However, what the Polish government decided to do was quite different. They were the only government during World War II that did this. They didn't retreat to the east and form a new capital and so forth, and then negotiate with Hitler. By the way, Hitler said told his generals he was quite willing to negotiate with them. He wasn't planning on taking the whole country. But the army fell apart so fast, and the government retreated so fast that before you knew it, around the 10th of September, the government was now collecting, and many of the military forces, along the border of Romania. Now, Poland doesn't have a border with Romania now. Now it's part of Ukraine. At that time, okay, it was part of these seized territories. So there was a border with Romania. So the Polish forces and the Polish government were together along the Romanian border. And on September the 17th, the Polish government crossed into Romania. Okay? So that meant a whole bunch of things, which I explain in detail in those books that I recommended to you. But one of the things it meant was that Poland no longer had a government. Romania, okay, was at peace with Germany and could not permit the Polish government to function as a government of Poland in Romania. Therefore, they were what's called interned, okay? They were no longer the legal government of Poland. What that meant in international law, and the Germans knew international law very well, as did the Russians, was that Poland was no longer a state. Okay, you're only a state when there's a government. Okay, Poland was no longer a state, which means that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was no longer in effect, because the Soviet Union had signed this treaty with Germany, and these secret codicils was discussion of the Polish state. So now there's no Polish state. So the German ambassador, Count von der Schulenburg, told Molotov, he said, listen, if the Red Army doesn't come in to occupy these territories, Germany is going to set up a Ukrainian nationalist, fascist, anti-communist state in these territories. And that's what's going to be on your border. And they actually took some steps to doing that, right? So, of course, Soviets really had no choice. And by the way, all the Allies agreed they had no choice. Winston Churchill said it was very good that they did what they did. It was very good that they should be occupying this eastern Poland. It was not only in the interest of the Soviet Union, he said, but it's in the interest of the Allies that they're doing this. None of the states, the League of Nations didn't expel the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union declared we're not at war with Poland. Okay? We're not part of the German-Polish conflict. All of the Allied states agreed. Except, of course, for the Polish government in exile. They said, no, we are at war with the Soviet Union. Well, the fact that the Polish government said they were at war with the Soviet Union meant that all of these Poles now that are in Russian captivity, the ones who are in the eastern Poland, are now prisoners of war. Or are they? Depending on how you look at this, right? The Soviets say they're not prisoners of war because we're not at war with Poland, right? But the Polish government says we are at war with you, therefore these are prisoners of war. This is where this whole mess about the Polish officers and Katyn massacre and so on, it all comes out in this situation. But the bottom line is the Soviets had really no choice to send in the army into these territories. So it's not as if they said, okay, now this is our chance to take back these territories that were seized from us. That was not the way it unfolded. The way everybody thought it was going to unfold was that the Polish government would set up set up a new government in these eastern territories, and there would be a buffer state, and they would sign a treaty with Hitler, which Hitler was willing to sign, and they would lose a lot of territory, but there would still be a Poland. So the Polish government did something that was, uniquely cowardly, if you want. They completely abandoned the Polish population to the Germans, and no other government did that. The Polish government Polish nationalists since the war, the Polish government since 1990, have been trying to cover this up. Have been denying that this is the case, but it is the case, and you can read about the fine points and the legal arguments and the international law and so forth and so on in those materials that I cited. Okay, the gulags. I guess I'm going to have to write a book about the gulags. Gulag, I think, there's a lot of nonsense written about the gulags. I mean, Gulag was a major part. Gulag means labor camp, right? Actually, the word Gulag simply means the administration of a labor camp. Okay, there are all these labor camps. The Soviets had prisons too, but they were not nearly as important in the overall system as the labor camps. The labor camps were where prisoners worked, and they got paid, and they got good time off, and all of this kind of stuff, that you might expect. They had education, they had bands, they had theater groups, all of this kind of stuff. They were not death camps. Nobody, even the anti-communists, don't say that they were death camps. It was not at all what was going on there. They were labor camps. The United States had labor camps. France had labor camps. Lots of countries had camps where penal labor was required of the inmates. Nor was it true that any substantial proportion of the population of these camps were political prisoners. People were sent to the camps for criminal offenses. The defendants in the Moscow trials of 36, 37, and 38 were all tried and convicted for criminal offenses, participating in a gang that assassinated Kirov or that set off bombs in factories and so forth and so on. These are criminal offenses. The last chapter in my book, Blood Lies, my attack on Snyder, is all about Snyder's attempt to pin the label of anti-communism on Stalin and the anti-Semitism on Stalin and the Soviet Union. I can't summarize it here. I recommend that you read it. I'm not saying that you won't have any criticisms of it, but I try to be objective. But it is the case that after World War II, there just had to have been an increase in anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. I mean, large parts of the Soviet population had been under Nazi occupation for 3 years, and the Nazis pumped out tremendous anti-Semitic propaganda. But there was certainly no anti-Semitism in the leading ranks of the Bolshevik Party. I'm not saying that there weren't any members somewhere or other who were anti-Semitic, but certainly that was not the case with the leading members of there was no official governmental anti-Semitism. That kind of starts with the Khrushchev period. Okay. Now, there's lots of claims that there are, but I go into that business there in that book. Doug, collectivization and the famine, I cover, is Doug still here? Yes. I cover extensively in 2 of my books, Blood Lies, which we don't have any copies of here, and also Stalin Waiting for the Truth. I cover it extensively, okay, with lots and lots of, not only critique of what the liars say, but with the actual evidence. And there are some good scholars who completely refute all of this stuff about man-made famines and that collectivization was bad. In fact, collectivization was very beneficial. Stalingrad. There's a very good book by a guy named Jochen Hellbeck, Hellbeck. Okay? He's a German scholar, but he's teaching at Rutgers. He just happens to be teaching in New Jersey. It's got no connection to the fact that I live in New Jersey. That's where he happens to teach. He set himself years ago this project of going to Russia and interviewing not only doing a lot of research about the Stalingrad battle. His book is called, in English, it's called Stalingrad. In German, it's called something, the Stalingrad Protocol, the Stalingrad documents. But the book is called in English Stalingrad, Hellbeck. And he interviewed, not only did he study the documents, but he interviewed lots of survivors, which back then there were still a lot of survivors. Very, very interesting. And he argues strongly, he's not pro-Stalin in any sense, you know. He argues very strongly that this anti-communist, this myth that the soldiers fought because the NKVD had machine guns behind it is false. Not that it's completely false. Some soldiers who retreated were in fact shot.
But it's a question of the domain.
But it's a question of numbers, and it's also a question of motivation. One of the things he argues is that the party commissars, they had commissars in the army, who were just in charge of morale and, you know, Marxist education and so forth and so on, played a big role in keeping up the morale of the soldiers, so that you know, there was a lot of I guess not only old-fashioned patriotism, but also desire to fight and conquer, fight off the Nazis and preserve the socialist state. So you need to read his book. You know, he does go at the beginning, he tries to ward off any accusations that might come his way that he's being pro-Stalin or something, but it's actually a very, very good book. And he did an awful lot of research. If you send me an email, there was a sort of summary article in English that came out when the book first came out in German, in a journal called the Berlin Journal, which gives you a sort of quick and dirty overview. Some of the German soldiers who were captured at Stalingrad, taken away to labor camps, by the way, became communists and moved back to East Germany. He interviews some guy who's in his 90s, who's got to be dead now, saying, you know, yeah, communism, socialism collapsed in Germany, but I think socialism is going to be the future of mankind, and I learned this, you know, from fighting in Hitler's war and being captured by the Soviets, and they convinced me that socialism is the future of mankind. And it's really, really interesting stuff. Completely different from the kind of stuff that you get by Anthony Beevor, right, who's the big British name. He's a former military figure who writes books of lies about the Soviet Union all the time. He's the most famous, I think, among those people who say that the Soviet soldiers only fought because they had the NKVD behind them, machine guns. Beevor, B-E-E-V-O-R, but I'm not recommending him. He's just a super anti-communist guy. I didn't copy down what Farshid's question was, so let me go on. And I recommend Charlie's book, The Hollow Colossus, and I assume that you've had him speak on that book here more than once, and maybe it's time to do it again, because it's a really, really very an excellent discussion of some of these questions that we've been discussing here. It's not, of course, directly on Soviet history. It's more about, you know, the theory of socialism. And so I strongly recommend Charlie's book. He's very modest in mentioning it. What was Farshid's question? He's not here. Larry, you're leaving?
No.
Okay, good. Farshid left, so that's it. That takes care of all the questions so far.
Okay, now one person I missed here is Richard Johnson, but you're going to ask him at lunch that question.
You're passing, Richard?
Yes.
You're passing. Okay.
Could I say something?
I before you said something, I was just wanted to mention to you that in the Gulag,
Yeah.
one section was the kulaks who resisted the law
sure.
of collectivization. So that
Sure.
probably was the largest number, perhaps, or maybe not, but it was a very large section that was
Okay.
in the gulags, and they were sent there with the family. So you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so it's sort of, this is the problem. People use the word gulag as though it means a camp, but actually it's the administration. The word gulag means state administration of camps. Okay? So under the state administration of camps, there were various kinds of places, institutions. The kulaks were not sent to labor camps, okay? I mean, they were under this administrative organ called the Gulag, the state administration of camps, but they weren't sent to labor camps. They were exiled. That is, they were picked up and moved from wherever they were to some other area, where they were given, I mean, they could take certain materials with them, and they were given implements to settle down and start farming as regular peasants, okay? Encouraged to join collective farms, which were being formed at that time. Many did, unquestionably some refused, but they were picked up and moved, okay, so that without the presence of this conservative, very capitalist-oriented element, collective farms could be, hopefully, successfully formed in those areas. So they weren't in camps, they were simply exiled, that is to say, moved to another part of the Soviet Union, where most of their families still lived. I mean, it's not like they moved back. No doubt a few moved back, but for the most part, they still lived there. The Kazakhstan was a good common location, and there were others. They were moved to the east. Good place to be, the east, after World War II starts, of course, because you were away from the heavy fighting. So that's the case with the kulaks, okay? They were not brought up before judges and convicted of a crime and sent to a penal institution. They were exiled. That was the case with all of these deported peoples that I alluded to in my talk too, not only the Chechens and the English and the Crimean Tatars and the Volga Germans and so forth, but also the Polish settlers who had been sent by the Polish imperialists to as the Polish infrastructure in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine after 1921, they were also deported. They were moved to the east, where, as it turned out, if they hadn't been moved, probably a lot of them would have been killed by the Germans in World War II, because that area was occupied by the Nazis, but they were moved to the east. So they were not put in penal camps. They were resettled, and many of their descendants still live there. Same with the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian anti-communist, nationalist, governmental superstructures and so forth and so on. And once the Soviets occupied these territories, they didn't let them vote. You see, you talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat. They had elections. You want to join the Soviet Union or not, but these people weren't allowed to vote. The bourgeoisie was not allowed to vote. Okay? So, of course, this is considered a great crime today by the nationalists and the pro-Nazi forces and so forth who control these countries today. But in fact, the Soviets didn't let them vote, they let everybody else vote. In the case of, I've been studying Lithuania and Estonia. I don't know a lot about Latvia, but I've been studying Lithuania and Estonia. Lithuania and Estonia, let's talk about Estonia. Soviets moved in, all three of these countries were military dictatorships, okay, before the war. Militant anti-communist military dictatorships. Trade unions were outlawed. The Communist Party was outlawed. Basically, any kind of working class organization was outlawed. When the Soviets moved in, before they took over, they moved in. One of the things they demanded was not only that the government sign treaties that were friendly to the Soviet Union, because they were on their borders, right? They also demanded that they permit the Communist Party to function openly and that they permit trade unions to openly exist. Well, this had never happened in the history of those societies. Okay? So now this made the Soviet Union, which was reasonably popular beforehand, certainly among the communists, now it made the Soviet Union very popular among the working classes and certainly among the Communist Party. So what the Soviets wanted, somebody was telling me this before we started here. The Soviets, Carl, what the Soviets really wanted was popular front governments, right? Sort of like coalition governments between the pro-Soviet forces and the pro-bourgeois forces. That's not possible in those countries. There were no pro-bourgeois forces that would even consider joining a government that was friendly to the Soviet Union. Okay, anybody who was in the governmental sphere who had been friendly to the Soviet Union had long ago been pushed to the side, if not imprisoned. I mean, you just couldn't be pro-Soviet, right? And the working class elements, the union leaders, the Communist Party, they didn't want a coalition. They didn't want coalition governments. They wanted to be part of the Soviet Union. So the Soviets were faced with this solution. You know, we want to have a sort of popular front government, but there's nobody here who wants a popular front government. And by the way, that's the problem with the popular front line throughout Europe. Practically none of the ruling classes wanted it. The only reason the Spanish went along with it is because they were being attacked by Franco and the Germans and the Italians, right? If that hadn't been the case, it's not like the presidents of the Spanish Republic, any of them really wanted this, you know, the communist parties to be as powerful as they were, but they really didn't have any choice, right? This was the major support from the Spanish Republic, but they weren't. They would have been very happy if what the Spanish government wanted during the Spanish Republican government wanted more than anything during the Civil War was for Britain and France and the United States to support them, and then they could get rid of the Soviet Union. They did not trust the Soviets and the communists. They were not pro-communist. But the British and French and the United States didn't do that. So they were stuck. They were stuck with the Soviets, right? But it was not because they chose to be that way. And in France, the Popular Front government under Léon Blum only lasted a few months, okay? And that was because the French ruling class were much happier with the Nazis than they were with the Germans. There's some good research on than the Russians, than the Soviets, and than the communists. And so the whole idea of popular front governments just didn't work out. Okay, it sounded good, right? This is the way to defeat the Nazis. We'll have popular fronts, you know, alliances between the socialists and all forces who are anti-Nazi. But the forces who are anti-Nazi, for the most part, were ferociously anti-Soviet as well. Even in Czechoslovakia, the Czech government would not form, even after Munich, when they lost the Sudetenland, right? When the Allies gave them to Sudetenland, this Czech government would not form a government with or much less an alliance with pro-Soviet parties. They said if they did this, we would be at war with all of Europe. That was what the president of Czechoslovakia said. If we form this kind of government, we have this kind of alliance, we form this kind of government, we'll be at war with all of Europe. Okay? They realized that it was not politically possible. They couldn't do that. And this was Czechoslovakia, who really had no friends at all. Anybody who was willing to stand up for them except the Soviets, which is why the Soviets were kept out of Munich, right? The Soviets were not even consulted with Munich. And you know, the Allies certainly showed that they didn't give a damn about Czechoslovakia, but the Czech ruling class still would not have anything to do with a coalition government with the communists or anything like that. So this theory, this idea of the Popular Front never worked anywhere. And it didn't work after World War II either. That's what the Soviets really wanted with what became Eastern Europe, you know, the so-called communist bloc. They wanted coalition government. They wanted friendly governments, not necessarily at all socialist. But they couldn't get them. There weren't enough bourgeois forces that would be willing to do that. Anyway.
Okay, so I think we should stop at this point.
Sure.
And those who want to talk with Grover, come and have a lunch.
I only had 10
You can
seconds.